Listen to The Astonishing Junk Drawer exclusively at patreon.com/astonishinglegends.
I don't think people are taking time off work to hit this.
You sent me some video of you dancing around the kitchen. It was amazing.
Music any white drunk college kid can dance to.
I'll just stick with the AI stuff.
That's Rowan said that, not me.
My math teacher, she doesn't explain it that well.
Well, that's the hallucination, right? That's like AI hallucination.
We have lives too.
Mother Shipton's cave.
Rich Haddam is coming. Jim Harold is coming.
I'm doing a lot of laughing. Is it?
Right.
Astonishing Legends would like to thank Uncommon Goods, BetterHelp, our contributors at patreon.com, and you, our listeners, for making tonight's show possible.
Smithfield, West Virginia, was founded in January of 1786. The Smith family had already been there nearly 90 years by that point, but their family name would not stick. Because, as history often shows, locals find more practical names for their communities. By 1807, Smithfield became known as Middleway because its location was central to the trade for several surrounding towns, and there was another Smithfield about 150 miles away in Tidewater. But there was another name that snuck onto the book sometime before 1790. Wizard Clip. The odds are pretty good you've not heard of Wizard Clip, but maybe you're familiar with the story of the Bell Witch, or even Jeff the Talking Mongoose. If so, you may have been primed for the story that lends Wizard Clip its name. There are many similar elements to those other stories, but there are also strange and unusual differences. The story traces back to the early 19th century when an unknown stranger sought shelter at Adam Livingston's home. As the story goes, the stranger fell ill during his stay and asked for a Catholic priest to administer the last rites. This request was not met, and the stranger passed away without receiving this final sacrament. Following his death, strange events began to manifest within the Livingston household. The family started hearing a persistent sound similar to the snipping of scissors. At the same time, they discovered clothing and other items like boots and harnesses inexplicably cut into shapes resembling a crescent moon or a wizard clip. The Livingston house also experienced increased paranormal activities, including phenomena suggestive of demonic possession. The situation escalated so much that Father Prince Golitsyn, a Russian royal, was brought in to perform an exorcism. After this spiritual intervention, the paranormal activities began to slow and eventually halted. Whether this part of the story is apocryphal or not, in 2005, Father Golitsyn was designated a servant of God by the Pope. This is the first step on the road to canonization. With a success in abating the strange influences of the Wizard Clip, the formerly Lutheran Adam Livingston converted to Catholicism and donated around 35 acres of his land to the Catholic Church. That land, although disputed in the past, still belongs to the church today, and it is known as Priest Field. Years ago, a gentleman named Michael Kishbucher joined our volunteer research group, the Astonishing Research Corps. Mike has a master's degree in the science of strategic intelligence from the Department of Defense, as well as a Master of Strategy degree from Air War College. He was a shoo-in for doing what our friend Marie Mayhew refers to as free search for the show, and he has just published his second book since joining us, The Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip, America's First Poltergeist, from the History Press. Mike has comprehensively documented the story of this haunting with the assistance of Heather Moser, an Appalachian folklore expert, lead researcher, and producer for Small Town Monsters. And tonight, they both join us as we attempt to unravel the tale of the Wizard Clip.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
On one gruesome afternoon, a lady visitor was complimenting Mrs. Livingston on a fine flock of ducks waddling through her yard on their way, perhaps to the neighboring Appalachian Creek, when clip-clip with the uncanny and invisible shears. One after another, the ducks were cleanly decapitated in broad daylight before the very eyes of the ladies and many other witnesses. Historian Joseph Barry, as quoted in the Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip. And we're back, and what a month October was.
Yes, it was a lot of fun, but this is Astonishing Legends, and the weirdness continues, especially tonight. But first, a few very quick announcements. If you're among the folks who enjoyed the latest new show from the Astonishing Legends Network, Scared All the Time, it is now living exclusively on its own feed. So look for Scared All the Time wherever you get your podcasts.
And the Midnight Library is fast approaching 5 million downloads of its own now. So that's another show to find and subscribe to if you haven't already.
Two other quick announcements. If you've been a long, and I mean long-time listener of Astonishing
Wow.
Legends, then you may remember one of our very first guest hosts, Mark DeAndre.
That's right. Mark was in our very first episode back in October of 2014 about the tragic death of Hollywood B starlet and former Playboy model Yvette Vickers. He then returned for episode 6, Celebrity Cemetery, and once again for episode 17 called Collections and Connections. And I must say, he is one of the finest tour guides I have ever come across, especially for Hollywood lore, the gruesome kind.
It's funny you should say that because he has started his very own podcast.
Ah.
You Are My Density. That's the name of it, yes.
Mhm.
And he's a tour guide on this in a lot of ways. This
Yeah.
is not an Astonishing Legends show, folks. This is just a good friend of ours doing his own thing, but he's a fun guy to listen to, and I've heard all the ones he's done so far, and I think it's pretty great.
Yeah.
It's a bit stream of consciousness, but Mark has a great voice, tons of intense esoteric knowledge, as Forrest just said,
Right.
about Hollywood, weird celebrity encounters, and well, it's just kind of indescribable, but it's a fun show if you're looking for something weird.
That's funny you put that with Mark. Anyway, folks, he's just starting out. He's had no promotion, and we want him to keep doing it. So look for You Are My Density wherever you get your podcasts, and give it a listen and subscribe if you dig it. You may even hear him refer to his friend Scott in a few episodes.
Okay, last announcement, merch. The knit caps or beanies or toboggans or whatever you call them in your part of the country are back in stock. So just head to astonishinglegends.com and scroll down the page and click on Go to Store to see that stuff.
Yeah, toques. All right, folks, we've got a great show for you tonight. But before we bring our esteemed guests in, we'd like to share with you one of the initial accounts of the Legend of the Wizard Clip.
Yes, as you'll learn tonight, there are several accounts of this story, which is the case with all legends, of course. But on the plus side, Mike Kishbucher has dug up literally every single available one for us to talk about and talk about what's similar and different between them. But we wanted to start with what Mike calls a slightly edited version made available to him by the Middleway Historical Conservancy.
This version was published in 1936 and was written by R. Helen Bates. We're taking it from pages 18 through 20 of the Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip. The Legend of the Wizard Clip. In the southern part of historical Jefferson County, West Virginia, nestled among the foothills of the Blue Ridge, lies the ancient village of Wizard Clip. The land upon which the village is located was included in the grants made to Mr. William Smith in 1729 by Sir William Gooch, who was the proprietor of that part of Virginia at that time. Surrounded by majestic hills, this, the first home of Wizard Clip, was placed in a gloomy hollow near a bottomless lake. Among those that obtained land grants from Mr. Smith was a man named Livingston. Mr. Livingston selected land lying along Opequon Creek, but also adjoining the village. One night when the sky was inky black, the rain descended in torrents, and the winds rushed through the desolated pines with a wild bellow. A weary stranger presented himself at Mr. Livingston's door. With genial hospitality, the traveler was welcomed. A few hours after retiring, the stranger sent for Mr. Livingston and told him he was ill unto death. He requested that a Catholic priest might be sent for at once. Mr. Livingston was a bigoted man who hated the Catholic Church and swore no priest should enter his house. The stranger, to whom no name has been given, repeatedly begged that a priest be brought, but his host was obdurate. At the odd hour of midnight, while the elements fought their terrible battle, the soul of the stranger, unblessed and unshriven, took its flight. The next day, his body was buried in unconsecrated ground. For many years, his grave was pointed out to the curious. Then a curse seemed to rest upon Mr. Livingston and his possessions. A murrain seized his cattle. Strange and mysterious sounds were heard about the house, and things were as though ruled by a demon. More dreadful than aught else was clear, distinct, insistent clipping clipping which went on day and night. The bed linen, family and visitors' clothing, saddles, bridles, and harness were all clipped and always in crescent or half-moon shape. Nothing was sacred from the terrible shears. The witches and wizards were now holding high revels. Mr. Livingston, pursued by the horror of all this, dreamed a vivid dream in which he saw a man who promised to help him. On Sunday, his wife, a devoted Catholic, persuaded him to go with her to a Catholic service at Shepherdstown. The instant Mr. Livingston saw the priest, he cried out with streaming eyes, "That is the man who could rid me of the witches!" The priest was told the story. The next day, he visited the home of Mr. Livingston at Smithfield, Middleway, sprinkled some holy water on the house's threshold, prayed fervently, and consecrated the ground wherein the stranger lay buried. He declared deliverance had come. Sure enough, the clipping ceased, the witches were laid, and Mr. Livingston was free. Moved by gratitude, he gave the Catholic Church 40 acres along the Appalachian. The church still owns this land and receives rent from it. It is known as the priest's place. For 4 or 5 generations, it was in the care of the Mangini family. Recently, however, the church assumed control. A chapel has been erected on this site, and outdoor meetings are held frequently. It is the ideal spot for camping, and the church has extended its use as such to all. The spell cast upon the old village of Clip still lingers upon it, and the bottomless lake through which the witches are said to have rushed when the priests exorcised them is still here, and the Appalachian flows on, now calmly, now wildly, by the lonely grave of the stranger. R. Helen Bates, as quoted in the Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip.
All right, folks, we would like to welcome Michael Kishbucher and Heather Moser to the show. They're joining us tonight to talk about the Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip. We've given you a little bit of background on them, but now they're here with us. We've known both of them for a long time, so this is a little bit of old home week. But Mike and Heather, thank you for joining us. We'll start with you, Mike. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
I work for the Department of Defense. Started off in the Air Force at 20 years old. I work intelligence. Been doing it for 25 years now. Now I'm a civilian in federal service with the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Okay. And that's all you can tell us. Heather, also thank you for joining us. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
I am a researcher and producer for the documentary film company Small Town Monsters. I am also an author. Although I haven't had a book out yet, I have had articles in various journals and magazines. I'm also a classics professor at Kent State University. So Greek and Roman history and folklore, as far as that goes, and Appalachian born and raised. So my love is here at home.
And Heather was a huge, huge help with this project. I mean, she wrote entire sections of it. There was enough for me to try to wrap my head around just the wizard clip stuff. And then I had to figure out Bell Witch as well. And I was like, man, I'll just ask Heather.
You see it in every movie. It's like, I have to go, what's going on? I got to get to the library. Or you find a professor. And that's exactly what Mike did. Quick question, though, Heather. Were you at the Kent Paranormal Weekend way back in, was it 2017, Scott?
I was not.
Yeah, that's where we met Seth and Jim Harold, James Willis. And yeah, that turned out to be a pivotal.
Jill and Roger. Yeah, it's just weird.
It's a lot of fun. And that theater is spooky. The tour, we did some tours in there, and that's where we got introduced to the Haunted Housewives were there, and they had a DR60 recorder, which is what made us buy one, which led us to our whole Sally House experience. So,
I mean, it was at the center of the spider web, you could say. That's where I had downloaded the Spirit Storybox app, which they developed. And so there's a lot of connections that came forth from there, but just the theater itself is quite historic. And that's another example of trying to maintain, like Priest's Field Center that we're going to talk about here in a bit, of maintaining something with some historical background in a small town, which doesn't get a lot of visitors, but is a very important part of the local lore and legends in that it's kind of the center of town. So again, aside from being haunted in that aspect, it's a great magnet to draw people in. And Mike, could you tell us a little bit about the Pig Lady Festival and some of the other festivals and folklore where you actually, all three of you met a couple years ago?
Yeah, I started this festival, and it's focused on this local legend from a very small town in Pennsylvania. My dad and I wanted to focus more on folklore and traditional storytelling and traditional Halloween type events, more like a harvest festival rather than,
Right.
the jump scares and clowns chasing around, stuff like that. So we started that in 2019. And then, of course, 2020, COVID shut us down. And then in 2021, I invited Scott, and I was shocked when he said he'd come, because it's a very small little event.
Then when he showed up, of course, things got weird, and they were just, you're saying like the rabbit hole of a paranormal discussion.
So Brian Seach started the weird discussion. We asked him to talk about the Portage County chase because it blew right through there, if you're familiar with that legend. You drove down Route 51 where they chased it.
That's right.
To get there. He started with that. He talked for 15 minutes about it. And then somehow by the end, we were talking about Bigfoot and everything under the sun. So we get a little off track.
Yeah.
And that year we showed Small Town Monsters, Chestnut Ridge.
Oh,
yes.
indeed.
Classic.
Chestnut Ridge.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chestnut Ridge. Yep.
And Heather introduced it. So that was great. That's where I got to meet Heather for the first time.
Well, then how did you get interested in the Wizard Clip story?
I wrote a book in 2016 through 2019. I wrote a book about the Pig Lady and some of the other local legends that were from my hometown. One of the books I researched is Devil's Ghost and Witches, Occult Folklore of the Upper Ohio Valley by a very famous folklorist named George Swetnam. He included the Pig Lady story in there, and then also the Wizard Clip. And those are the two stories that jumped out as being super weird. I always wanted to research it. And when I got down here in Virginia and I was so close by to Middleway, it just seemed right to do. So in 2020, I think Seth was doing a live stream, and I was sitting around a campfire because, couldn't do anything, with my daughters listening to it. And was talking about some other haunting in West Virginia, and it popped up in my head. And I just typed into the chat, "Hey, what about the Wizard Clip?" And he had never heard of it. So I was like, maybe I need to do something about this.
Yeah. Heather, were you familiar with it all that much before your connection here with Mike?
I was not familiar with it. I had come across it once while reading through Ruth Ann Music's work, but it was something that didn't really stick out to me as far as that goes. And then when Mike brought it up and reminded me, I was like, wait a second, there's some similarities here. This sounds somewhat familiar.
To remind our listeners, by the way, you're an expert on the Bell Witch case, among other in the region. So you must have thought, because I hadn't heard of it either until Mike mentioned it to me. I was like, what? How can we not know of this story? It's so strange.
Yeah, so the main family are the Livingstons, so a rather large Lutheran family that moved from Pennsylvania to Virginia in the 1770s. When they became overwhelmed with the poltergeist activity after years of it, they sought help from several different religions, and none of them provided relief. They all were thwarted one way or the other. So Adam had a dream in one of the versions that a priest could provide him help. So he went to the only Catholic family in the neighborhood, and they were 4 miles away. And these were the McSherrys. McSherrys were the ones that were able to put the Livingstons in touch with Father Cahill, who was the head priest in Shepherdstown, which was 36 miles away. He was the first to attempt an exorcism. It wasn't really an exorcism. It was more like a home blessing. And he then realized that the activity was stronger than he had originally understood. So as is today, exorcisms don't just happen willy-nilly. They have to be investigated. They have to be approved by a bishop. So Bishop Carroll, once he had read the letter from, what we assume a letter from Dennis Cahill, sent Father Glitzen to investigate. So an outside party. He spent 3 months investigating this activity and became thoroughly convinced that an exorcism was needed. He allegedly attempted the first exorcism once permission was given and didn't have the willpower to go through with it all. He got scared and ran from the house.
Wow.
Ended up finding Dennis Cahill, who was supposedly a big, brawny Irishman that was not afraid of this stuff.
That's another sign, as you had pointed out in the book, of possession. There's 3 criteria that have to be met. The second is obsession. The third being possession, which is the worst, but I believe the second one is feats of strength, and not the Festivus kind. Yeah.
The first one is just kind of a haunting.
Yeah.
The second one is more of like an attack on the family,
Mhm.
physical attacks. And then the third one is possession, where a body is possessed, or a house. In this case, it was the house they were exercising.
Right.
Yeah, Galitzin was kind of young when this was happening. This is only in his first 5 years within his arrival in the U.S. So Dennis Cahill would have been the senior priest. So he was the one that was able to exercise the home. And then that's when the visitor appeared in their living room a week later and started teaching them about the Catholic Church. And then the voice came after that.
So I think in terms of documentation, because that is so complicated and there's a lot of documentation, which you've managed to track everything down on, that's why people need to find this book, because it gives you such a great timeline. And again, just reminding our listeners, this is the Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip, America's First Poltergeist by Michael Kishbucher.
You know what are two great things to hear from folks during the holiday gift-giving season, or anytime really?
Oh, I know. It's, "That's so cool. Where'd you get that?" Or better yet, when you give someone an exclusive present, it's, "Wow, what a really thoughtful and special gift. It's perfect. Thank you so much. I love it."
That's absolutely right. It's nice to be recognized for your good taste, but way more wonderful to hear you really made someone's day with something that shows you really care about them.
Exactly. That's why this holiday season, Uncommon Goods is your secret weapon to get that perfect gift for someone you care about, or even yourself. Uncommon Goods is here to make your holiday shopping stress-free by scouring the globe for the most remarkable and truly unique gifts for everyone on your list.
Yep, whether you're shopping for your secret Santa or your entire family, Uncommon Goods knows exactly what they want. And just shopping on the Uncommon Goods website is so much fun. You just punch in some keywords that fit what type of gift you're looking for and get delightfully surprised by all the cool items that come up. Mom likes beauty products, so I found a Raw Juice Cleanse Facial Mask set that I know she'll love. And Dad, well, he can be hard to shop for. But I used Uncommon Goods Gift Finder tool to search for something I know he'll use. You just type in if it's a significant other, a friend, parent, sibling, child, etc. you're shopping for, select their interests, and bam, you have some great options to choose from. He's getting a travel watercolor paint kit because he loves plein air painting, and I know he's going to love this too.
Well, what we also love is that when you shop at Uncommon Goods, you're supporting artists and small independent businesses. These fine products are often made in small batches, so shop now before they sell out this holiday season.
Uncommon Goods looks for products that are high quality, unique, and often handmade or made in the U.S. They have the most meaningful, out-of-the-ordinary gifts anywhere, and many I found you can have personalized, which makes the gift even more special.
From art and jewelry to kitchen, home, and bar, Uncommon Goods has something for everyone. Now, these aren't the same old everyday gifts you find on your average sites, or like a gift card, which to me says, "Here, I fulfilled my obligation and spent the least amount of effort doing it."
And with every purchase you make at Uncommon Goods, they give back $1 to a nonprofit partner of your choice. They've donated more than $2.5 million to date.
Nice. Well, to get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/astonishing.
That's uncommongoods.com/astonishing for 15% off.
Don't miss out on this limited time offer.
Uncommon Goods. We're all out of the ordinary. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp.
Well, that was quite a tremendous Halloween season offering this last month. It was a lot of work, but we enjoyed producing it all, and we hope everyone enjoyed listening to it.
Yes, we certainly do. And yes, it was a lot. And it was quite a busy summer as always. And now we're facing the holidays and all that brings. I think it's easy for people to forget that while we're doing all the show stuff, we also have lives filled with personal obligations like bills, family responsibilities, relationships, business commitments. It can often all feel like too much. So we definitely get it that at any time of the year, but especially during the holidays, it's too easy to be filled with anxiety, to feel super stressed out or constantly overwhelmed, not even knowing what to do next or how you'll get through it all. But we also know that you don't have to endure it all by yourself. You don't have to suffer through all the pressure and worry alone.
No, you don't. And yeah, we all have those tensions every day. And at the end of the year, they all seem to build to a boiling point. And the gloomy winter weather doesn't help either. So it's natural to feel some sadness or anxiety. But you can do something about it by adding something new and positive to your life that can counteract some of those feelings, because you know they don't often go away on their own.
And that's where BetterHelp can help. Look, you don't have to have gone through a major trauma to benefit from therapy or to think you finally have a reason to get it. What would really help any situation that causes negative feelings is to talk to a professional about it, to know how to set boundaries and gain the tools for learning positive coping skills. That is how you become a better version of yourself.
Sometimes you just need a little boost with a little grounding, something to look forward to, someone to talk to who knows how to help you manage everything that's going on in your life. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and it's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule so you can get the help you need when you need it. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge.
Find your bright spot this season with BetterHelp.
Visit betterhelp.com/astonishing today to get 10% off your first month.
That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/astonishing.
Hey, this is Zach from Moser, the band in Adelaide, Australia. You're listening to Astonishing Legends. Now, let's get back to the show.
You know, and also one of the things I like about your approach, Mike, is being a logical and reasoned person and having to maintain that position and your background with your degrees and your experience in looking at these kinds of stories and taking that approach as your primary approach. It leads you to investigate things in a different way from 99% of the people in our field, I would say.
Yeah.
And I really like that. And that's something I've enjoyed about whenever we've hung out in person and then also just when we're communicating online. I feel like I know at the basis of what you're doing, you're really following the folklore here, but it's going to be a pretty tall order to convince you that something magical actually happened. Am I right?
I focused a lot of this on the theme of belief.
Yes.
That first book I wrote was more about finding the truth. This one, I didn't care about finding the truth. I wanted to figure out why people believed what they believed.
Right.
And cause them to act on it. I mean, there's real history there. This really affected people's lives. So that was my motivation.
That's a really great approach. So I think that's part of what makes it so interesting. One of the things, I want to quote you, something you said on page 15, you said too, that I of course love this quote: skepticism can be helpful, but cynicism is often a bully's tool, which I thought was a really great line and really useful. And that's, again, what I liked about how you went into this. So we have the Livingston family. Can you tell our listeners just a little bit about their background and who the various people are that are afflicted with this at the outset?
Well, Adam's the protagonist. There's varying versions that say that, he's got like 6 kids. Some say that's 8, it depends on who tells the story. But he's got a large family. His first wife died in Pennsylvania probably before he moved to Virginia. But he inherited property in Virginia from his father, who had purchased land sight unseen. But I guess that was common for the time. He just never got to use it. So Adam inherited it and moved his family and his enslaved people with them to Virginia and started a farm. His property adjoined his sister and brother-in-law's property. So they had a very large chunk of land there.
That was like 150, 160 acres, right? Or something of that nature.
Adams was about 350. And then
wow.
His sister's was another 150.
So when he got there, he's no longer a young man. He's up in his 30s or 40s or somewhere in there. His first wife had passed away. And so now he's his second wife. And so he's living in this area. And so at the onset of this story, what's the first thing that starts to happen to him?
The first thing that happened that was odd was they were gathered around the fireplace, the hearth, one fall evening. It was a crisp evening. And the fire just started shooting out of the fireplace, and logs on fire would shoot across the floor, and they would have to run around trying to put it out before their cabin caught fire.
Right.
And they thought that was weird. They eventually just put the fire out and suffered from the cold because it wouldn't stop doing it. And then lots of odd things began within that first week. Their farm laid along a route that's still there today that was prominent for transport of goods between 2 large cities for the time, Winchester and Shepherdstown. And for some reason, these teamsters would pull up these large wagons loaded with goods and stop in front of the house and start berating the family. But they would see a large rope tied across the road stopping them, and the family couldn't see it. It wasn't there. So
Mm.
this happened for a couple weeks. So just for some reason, this thing started either trying to burn the house down or make them look bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Heather, are there details? It's been a minute for me, like that are similar in the Bell Witch with that kind of thing?
No, with the Bell Witch, it started with John Bell seeing a creature that looked fairly odd, half dog, half rabbit kind of
Right.
situation.
Right.
And then scratches and gnawing on bedposts and things like that, but not something that would have been seen in the community until they had started inviting people in to help them kind of solve what was going on.
Right. Okay. Once this stuff starts happening, one of the things that you talk about, Mike, is that a lot of the details throughout history seem to come from the McSherry family.
Almost all of them. Yeah.
Who were the McSherrys? Because again, another parallel with the Bell family is that a lot of that Bell family story is connected to their neighbors as well. They're the only witnesses, or the closest witnesses. They're part of the story as well. And so you have with the Bell family,
The Johnstons.
the Johnstons being neighbors and also tellers of the story and keepers of that story. And even a couple of years ago, we turned Mike onto a book written by one of the descendants of the Johnston family. And here with the Livingstons, their neighbors are very involved, except that they're, I guess, opposites culturally and financially. They're very well-to-do. They're Irish immigrant merchants who did very well and have some respect in the village, as these other families did as well. Same thing with the Bells.
Why do you think all the details come to us from the McSherrys?
I wrestled with this question for a long time because I don't understand why some of the investigators that wrote the earliest versions of the story didn't go talk to Adam. He was still around.
Yeah.
So they would go to the McSherrys. Maybe it's because they were still there in Middleway. I don't know. But it bothered me a lot because Adam didn't move that far away, and he had all his kids were there. He moved to Bedford, Pennsylvania, which it's far for a horseback.
Sure.
But if you're really that interested in figuring out what happened, go talk to the main person.
Right. Right.
Well, the other odd thing is that the family members of the McSherrys didn't all agree on the happenings, right? They disagreed with each other's accounts. And the patriarch, well, there's two brothers. So Richard McSherry kind of denied any of the happenings. And it seemed like he wanted to distance himself from the whole debacle because he's a businessman. He's got, he doesn't need this kind of publicity.
Yeah, and his two sons as well. One was a doctor and the other one was a lawyer, and they both denied it as well. It's the female members of the family that really added to the story and made it grow and made sure that it ended up in newspapers and things like that.
Let's talk a little bit about the story itself and all the varying versions of it. And because when you went to Middleway, when you went to the town, did you find that one particular version was more prominent for the locals than the other, or they just embraced the whole thing?
Still, there's a major difference today in Middleway. From the locals, the one they hand out is the R. Helen Bates version from the Conservancy.
Okay.
And that's, very focused on witchcraft. But if you go on to Priestfield, which is also in Middleway, then they tell their version, which is more about the conversion of a Lutheran family that was tormented by a demon.
Right.
Now, is that mostly encapsulated in what you have in the book as the Woodstock letters? R. Helen Bates, her story would come out around 1936. The Woodstock letters around 1907, so a much earlier version of an even earlier episode of events. Is that what you're talking about when that's more of a different view of the two competing views?
It's very different. The oldest versions are from the church. I think 1817 is the oldest recorded version. And if you read it today, it's only about 20 pages. It's very different than the R. Helen Bates version.
Right.
It doesn't mention the occult at all, really. It talks about a haunting, but, there's no witches or other folks attacking the family that are mortal.
For folks that haven't read the book yet, what would you say leads to the differences between just those two versions, for example?
I really think it has to do with your religious upbringing. If you were brought up Protestant in that time frame, ghosts didn't exist. When you died, you either went straight to heaven or hell. Whereas Catholics believe that folks in purgatory could affect day-to-day lives.
Okay.
That's a major component of at least the spiritual attack, the spiritual oppression element of the story, in that the family is harassed physically and eventually verbally in all sorts of ways. And they're experienced a lot of property damage, and their cattle died. the barn burnt down, all the classic stuff. But in the Catholic version, having that middle ground between heaven and hell, in that version of the story, where the voices, again, one version, claim to have been, and that's why they are tormented and need help from the family, is that they are stuck in purgatory. They require prayers and penitence and a lot of help from the living. Another aspect of a good ghost story is that, you know, the ghost comes back and wants you to help them solve their murder, or they have a message to relay. Right. So they need help from the living. They can do all these fabulous stuff, except they still need human help. You know, they can do all these supernatural feats, but they still demand attention mostly and favors from the living. So in the Catholic version, you're saying is that element of a belief in purgatory adds a lot to that aspect of the story as a cautionary tale, but also as a source of drama.
I think so, yeah. The main difference is Protestants at that time felt that if you were being attacked spiritually, it was because some human was conjuring something to attack you.
Okay, so it's like a curse in a way.
Yeah, so a witch.
Right, or a witch or whatever. So they're conjuring something. Wow. Okay, so that's fascinating to me. I don't have a great understanding of the theological differences, and didn't until I read your book really get the big picture of the theological differences and how those filters would be affecting the telling of these stories. And so one of the things that I took away from it is like there's really a pretty big mixture of whatever people thought actually happened as these storytellers, a term you use a lot, which again, you know, we're storytellers, we're all kind of storytellers, but when you put that label on these folks that are relaying this folklore throughout the decades, and then you think about each storyteller's character Bible, really, for like, you know, my wife's a writer, so I'm using writer's terms, but like they have a background, and you know, what is their religion? What is the time period they're living in? What are the prevalent concerns in this time period? And what are the concerns specifically relating to their religion? And you do a really good job of explaining that and how that's affecting the story. So I guess one of my questions for you is, do you guys think that one of the things that happens that makes the story more complicated is that any meandering details that are added are done because the storyteller at that particular version is trying really hard to weave in details that advance their personal narrative?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, any good storyteller is going to elaborate a bit.
Right.
And make it their own. So that's why I included everything that I could find, whether it was written as something factual by one of the priests that were writing histories, or one of the folklorists like Ruth Ann Music. I included it all. I didn't want to leave anything out because it's all interesting and it all adds to the story.
So when in addition to like personalizing it though, do you think maybe there's agendas at hand on the part of whatever theological institution they're representing at any given moment? Like, okay, well, this is how we feel, or we're trying to squash what's happening with spiritualism, or we're trying to squash whatever, you know, come to the church or come to this specific church, don't go to that one, because if you go to that one, like they're all trying to take control. This is what can happen. Look what can go wrong if you start dabbling in the dark arts or whatever. So does that seem like that's what you thought was happening as you uncovered these different versions?
For the church versions, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, they were very anti-Lutheran, very anti-Reformation. I mean, it was dripping with it. It was obvious. It wasn't.
Right.
They weren't trying to hide their bias.
Yeah, so they're piggybacking. This story's already out there. It almost might not even matter if they believe it as much as they're like, oh, look what we can do with this. We have a megaphone. You know, it's like they've just been gifted a brand new TV, and TV hasn't been invented yet, and they're going to go on the air and tell all these, because they know it's going to go viral. And it's like, can we get on top of this? We're going to put our message on the back of it, regardless of what really went on there. Do you think that's a possibility?
Oh, no. And if you look at the time frames when the two times that it was written about heavily, in the early 1817 to 1825, 1830-ish, that was right around the Second Great Awakening, when Protestant revivals were huge across the country. So you can see why the Catholic historians would have found use or utility in the story of a family, a Protestant family that was being tormented for years and couldn't find any help from any Protestant service until the Catholic preacher came riding in on his horse and saved the day. I mean, there's I don't want to call it propaganda, but that's probably the best word. I was going to say the second time was during spiritualism. Father Fanati's version was written in I'm going to get this wrong, 1879, 1894, I can't remember off the top of my head, but right there in the height of spiritualism.
The Fox sisters starting in the 1840s, 1850s, around that time. And so it over the next couple of decades, it's really building up a head of steam, which also, as we covered in our Ouija series, the popularity of that delightful family board game also rode the back of spiritism, spiritualism, those movements, and also as a backdrop now at the first part of the 20th century, you have World War I and a lot of death and suffering, and there's a lot of socio-cultural aspects that played into the popularity of that movement and those ideas, and it's the same thing here. What are then some of the other story elements? Because I come at this all very fascinated by the background of politics and religion as it played into early American political formations, starting from the founding fathers, who were more deist, and that they think, they believed it's like, well, there is a creator, but he's kind of hands off. So the rest of this stuff is you folks going kind of nuts here and bringing your old ways, traditions from Europe, and it's creating a lot of strife. And so you have these competing backdrops of American Enlightenment ideals that have come from Europe and some of those great thinkers, and that's also come with the migration of a lot of European immigrants. But before we move on, what were some of the other story elements? Because I also look at this, as I said, I'm fascinated by the other backdrops, but just as pure story and as a narrative and how that gets transmuted over the decades into fitting something that works for a lot of people, or they use it, as Scott said, it's piggybacked onto as a medium that people can use for their own devices. What are some of the other differences between the Bates story version and the other common tellings as far as stories? Like you could talk about the stranger or the burning. It takes another turn. So what are some of those other story elements that differ from a more generalized Bates version?
The Bates version are the more of a folkloric versions. All of them really stop with the poltergeist activity. Right. So the voice is not addressed in hardly any of the more folkloric versions, or I call them secular in the book, but they're Protestant versions. Yeah. So the voice, I found the voice to be incredibly similar to the Bell Witch.
Right.
It started as a small little things go missing, you hear bump in the night, scratching, and then full on poltergeist activity, stuff flying around the house, things catching on fire. And then a voice emerges. In the Catholic version, there was an exorcism that was in between there, and they're two different entities. So that's the main difference between the Bell Witch story and this story. But I'm not so sure that's how the earliest storytellers came up with the original narrative.
Right. For our listeners, what kinds of things was the voice saying to people?
The voice was very critical. It complained about a lot. It didn't like how people dressed. It didn't like how people prayed. It would scream for prayers all night long, pretty much. But it also is credited with converting the family to Catholicism. So a lot of the church versions talk about it being a sweet and caring entity that brought them into the church because the services were so disparate. There's too far to get to a priest, so this thing came and taught them how to do all the catechisms.
It's an early church Zoom meeting during the lockdowns. It's just kind of, we'll come to you and admonish you for everything you're doing. A quick question, Heather, or this story element of the voice as both giving advice and berating people and putting them down and with the usual insults and all the other paranormal aspects of bilocation, knowing things from the future, premonition. Do you find that a lot in other folk tales that involved a supernatural aspect?
Actually, no, I don't come across that very often. With the Bell Witch, that story's so in depth with the characteristics, the behavior, the attitude that she had. It was so in detail that you don't really come across that level of communication in other regular folk tales. So no, I don't get a lot of stories of a spirit or ghost or witch or hobgoblin or however you may want to classify it, criticizing a family or saying that they're ready to kill somebody and not giving a reason why, or coming up with a million excuses as to who they are just to laugh at you when you're trying to prove whether that's true or not.
Right.
Yeah, that's not very common.
Not very common. I mean, we all grew up with fairy tales from childhood, and a lot of the times you see this. The other scenario as far as the story goes is that there's no story element of outsmarting the visitor, of tricking them, and there's no seeming moral to it other than like do all this really outrageous and troublesome stuff, this really inconvenient stuff, like the voice was telling them later, the disembodied voice that eventually emerged. Well, also both in the Bell story and in the Wizard Clip story, in that it's like, you're going to have to now pray for 3-4 hours a day. I'm going to keep you up all night. And it's a tall order. It's a big ask for a family. And it's like, okay, we're doing this, but you're trying to instruct us. And, we've turned around, and thanks for stopping the trouble that you apparently caused now that we're doing this. But there's no end to it. It just kind of goes away. And so all these other stories, you got a beginning, middle, and end. The hero wins, rides off into the sunset, gets the pot of gold, whatever it is. In this, it's just basically like, well, eventually we'll kind of stop tormenting you. And then you're going to have a regular life on top of your already very much filled with toil and hard work and disease and shortened lives. I mean, that's the sense that I got from this story, is that you have these other elements that are supposed to be instructional, but it's really kind of loose. And Heather, you don't see that with other folktales. Is there more of a conclusive ending? Is there more of like, and that's what you don't do? Or, like,
yes. Well, for one, in a lot of folktales, they're a lot shorter.
Yeah.
So there's not as much detail, but the whole point is to tell you a lesson, to teach you something. So yeah, there is a conclusion where with the Bell Witch, something like that. I mean, John Bell dies, and we still don't know why she chose him, why he was being tormented so much. And there was really nothing they could do to ease the pain and conflict and torment that she was giving the family. So,
right.
But in a lot of folk tales, they're more like lessons, moral stories. And that's not so clear cut when it comes to something like the Bell Witch.
At least they only had to deal with it for 4 years, right?
That's true. That's true.
And poor Livingstons were haunted by the poltergeist for 7 or 8 years, and then the voice came and stayed with them another 17.
Yeah.
I still want to talk about one fascinating fictional, perhaps, player to the story. We still don't know. And he appears in certain versions and not in others. The appearance of the mystical stranger who shows up, because in the Wizard Clip story, there's actually two. First is the stranger on the dark and stormy night who looks for shelter at death's door, in this case, the Livingston door, and is given hospitality as per social rules back then, and was given a bed, except denied one thing, in that the stranger, being, they think, in one story version, an Irish Catholic traveler of perhaps a menial worker, down on his luck, goes in and is at near death. And so during one night, he believes that he doesn't have long to live. He asks Adam Livingston if a priest could be sent. And as Mike alluded to earlier, like, the local church was not just a couple blocks down by the Dairy Queen. This is a long ways to go for
40 miles or so.
Yeah, 36 miles.
Yeah, quite a long ways on horseback in the middle of the night. And for whatever reason, and again, the two versions that differ between Bates and the Woodstock story is that in one I read, generally Adam Livingston is a nice man, pious, except that he was bigoted against Catholics and refused to send for a priest. A priest would not step through his doorway. The other version of the story is that his wife, I guess in the first one, that she is a devout Catholic and tries to convince him, but it's too late. It eventually tries to convince Adam, her husband, to attend Catholic church, and that's where he gets his salvation eventually. In the other version, though, is that the wife was not devout, and this conversion to Catholicism from Protestantism happens through a dream that Adam has. In both versions, though, the stranger shows up, is denied, and that denial is the start of their problems, and that now this person's in purgatory, crying out for help. Adam needs to be shown his bigoted ways and come around again. And so that's the plot device of the stranger showing up. And we don't know to this day if there ever was a stranger. Do either of you believe that that was more a story element that's fictional, or perhaps maybe there was a visitor and that was just a plot point that actually happened, which is just adds to the drama of the story and makes it more listenable?
I think there was a visitor in one of the letters. The Father Galitzin references a visitor that was Irish Catholic and got spooked by the haunting and said, "You really should get a priest." And he said, "I've tried some of those before.
Right.
I'm not going to bother." But he didn't die. He just left. So I think
right.
folks, storytellers use that plot point to try and explain why the haunting was happening. There was no reason giving for the haunting, kind of like the problem with why the Bell Witch hated John Bell. We still don't know.
Right. So it was like, this is what makes this part of the story work. We can't find this. We either need cognitive closure, or we need the story to work better so that our message works better with it, or something to that effect.
Exactly. Yeah. The earliest version I could find was a version where somebody was murdered in the house and was buried, and that person was coming back to cause the haunting. And this was before the stranger narrative got, I guess, solidified later on. But when I was researching that, I was also reading a book on spiritualism at the same time for some reason. And I found it very interesting that the Fox sisters, their event started off with a poltergeist as well, who claimed to have been murdered by John Bell. He said he was killed by somebody named John Bell.
There you go.
This whole thing just started with my curiosity about looking at the land deed and seeing that when Adam sold his property in 1809, the rest of the property they didn't give to the church. It was sold to two brothers named Bell.
Right.
And a confirmation bias, I just thought, okay, so these are related to the Bells in Tennessee. They moved the story to, a little west and changed it.
You contacted me when you made that realization. My cognitive bias was like, oh, see, it's everybody's haunted. And yours was like, oh, they took the story. The story traveled this way. And I'm like, no, the ghost traveled this way. So I just thought that's very funny.
Is this just part of human experience that we think of the same tropes and we think of the same elements in our ghost stories, and we just bring them wherever we go?
I think that a lot of that is exactly what happens. Even going back to the idea of the stranger, that's something that we've had in our consciousness since at least the Roman times, the story of Bacchus and Philemon, entertaining gods and not realizing it. It was just some strangers that had been turned away, and that ends up becoming a boon for them later in life. Well, very soon later in life, actually, as the city was destroyed by a flood. But I think that this is something that we do take bits and pieces, and it allows us then later as historians to go back and we can extrapolate different sections and see where all of these threads have gone through, and you can find where, okay, these are the Scotch-Irish beliefs. I get that. I see how that came in. But yeah, I think that with a lot of stuff, that's exactly what we do.
Yeah, I referenced an older story that's Scotch-Irish in there called The Devil of Clonloose.
Which is amazingly similar, just freakily.
It's so similar.
Yeah.
Even the clipping, the fire, and so you can see how a lot of stories like that can travel with immigrants.
Right.
So that the area where the Middleway is today was very heavily Scotch-Irish.
Do you feel like you found a path, a clear path of how that might have happened in the case of the Wizard clip?
I think that's definitely a very big possibility, but that's only one of them. That's why I included an alternative analysis in the book.
Right. I am so excited to tell our listeners about this new podcast because it's co-hosted by one of my dearest friends in the world, Rachel Dratch. Now, for those of you who don't know who Rachel is, she was on Saturday Night Live for 7 years, 5 of which my wife Emily was there for too. If you're still unsure what I'm talking about, I bet you know who Debbie Downer is. That was one of her many hilariously brilliant characters.
Yes, that famous sketch that came apart live on the air.
I was there when it happened, and it was amazing. But the other thing about Rachel is that we spent a lot of time hanging out over the years, and she's honestly as fascinated with the paranormal as we are here. And it's no surprise to me at all that she's launched her own comedy podcast about it called Woo Woo. She and my wife Emily and I used to sit around till 3 a.m. in various Manhattan restaurants, having drinks and talking about ghosts, and yes, laughing about them too. She loves this stuff.
Oh, Scott, that's terrific. And now we need to get to the talking points.
I know. I'm just saying the show is great.
Yes,
it's so
indeed.
well produced.
Yes.
And Rachel's co-host is a lifelong friend of hers, Irene Bremis. They have great chemistry. So find and subscribe to Woo Woo, where you'll find Rachel Dratch getting woo woo, discussing stories of the unexplained, the eerie, and otherworldly with her funny friends in her new comedy podcast, Woo Woo with Rachel Dratch.
And what a great name for a show. It's just so much fun to say. And if you love to woo like we do, we know you will love Woo Woo too.
Irene and Rachel invite guests to share stories they may only tell a trusted pal who will not judge.
Just like us.
Psychics?
I want to hear what they have to say.
Spirits?
I do enjoy a cocktail now and then.
Astral projection?
I'm projecting right now as we speak.
Check, check, and check. Sure, you may think we live in a world where there's a logical explanation for anything out of the ordinary, but after you spend some time with Rachel and her pals, you might have your doubts and find that you too are woo-woo.
I've been called worse.
Join Rachel, Irene, and friends in a comedy podcast that turns the mysterious into a lively conversation among kindred spirits.
Search for Woo Woo with Rachel Dratch wherever you're listening now.
Hi, I'm Scarlett, and you're listening to Astonishing Legends, the best podcast this side of the asteroid belt.
Is there any evidence left of any of these clipped items that had a crescent-shaped clipping, which I found very symbolic, in all the materials that was left over? Do you think there's anything, a shirt with a handprint burned into it, a boot that's cut into a spiral? Do you think that there's anything left of evidence?
I don't think there's anything left from the clipping. I do think that there are things left over. For instance, Georgetown University has the cradle where one of McCaskey's children was attacked.
Right.
By whatever this entity was. And they still have it on display.
Yeah, you have a picture of it. It's fascinating to think that, again, it's like any evidence that something weird touched this item, and there's the item. In the Woodstock Letters version here, there is another mysterious stranger that shows up. So we're talking the account published in about 1907, reading from Mike's book here, from Woodstock College, from years of the publication from 1872 to 1969. Quite a run. And it's a Catholic narrative. Again, so here's what we have that I found on page 24, because as the Woodstock narrative goes on, if foretold events, which were always verified and explained, the meaning of many others, we're talking about the messages here, there is another messenger that shows up. So reading from Mike's passage here from the Woodstock Letters, upon one occasion, Mr. Livingston and his family were together in one room when there appeared among them a young man very poorly clad, and though it was a bitterly cold day, barefooted. They asked him where he came from, and he answered, "From my father." "Where are you going?" "I am going to my father," he said, "and I have come to teach you the way of him." And he stayed with them for 3 days and nights, 3 being, I think, very symbolic here, instructing them in all the points of Christian doctrine. And they asked him if he was not cold, and they offered him a pair of shoes, and he replied that his country was neither hot nor cold. So he's from a nether region, a different world. And when he left the house, the same idea occurred to each of them. They had not noticed when he came in, so they would watch and see what direction he took when going away. They saw him enter a lot in the front of the house and then disappear. So he disappeared in front of their eyes very mysteriously. But the point here is that it sounds like they were visited, as Heather was saying, by a God, or in this case, Jesus, or something representative of Jesus, talking about his father and the way of his father, and instructing them, and then just after 3 days making a mysterious disappearance. Is that what you think the story element is?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And that part of the story always bothered me, because who's just sitting around the living room and somebody shows up in their house and they're like, "Hey, hang out." You know?
Just barefoot. Yeah, and it's like, and we're going to basically listen to, again, there's no TV or internet. So a stranger shows up, you invite them to play cards or have meat stew or whatever the case is. I think people are a lot more hospitable.
Wait, he didn't knock on the door. He appeared in their living room.
Yeah.
I had friends like that in college.
They just, I notice if you have European friends, they think nothing of coming to America to stay with you for 3 weeks. To their credit, though, you were welcome to stay with them for long periods of time. But here in America, it's like, as Twain said, after 3 days, fish and visitors start to stink. So, but this is early America, and they brought a lot of their European traditions with them. And it is a very strange, that's what struck me about this story. And you also see an appearance of some kind of deity a lot in UFO stories, and all these other paranormal stories are often make mention of Orfeo Angelucci. And in one of his last visits, he's half a mile from where I live right now, down by the LA River. And on the fence there, he sees a vision of Jesus come off the cross and approach him, and then morphs into the alien visitor that he was communicating with. So there's always this mysterious one last visit, it seems. And the last one is metaphorical for Christ. And so, yeah, this is an odd thing, but it appears in a lot of stories. But it's weird that it's stuck into this narrative just kind of willy-nilly, and then he just vanishes. I'm like, well, there you go. He just came for 3 days of a mini seminar and disappeared. But it is kind of on the nose, I guess, as they would say.
Yeah, and I find it just as weird that the voice stuck around for 17 years and then it just left for no reason.
Right. So in terms of that and the differences between, of course, we see these things differently because of our approaches, but the differences between like the voice being something that people actually experienced as opposed to a story that's just being passed on for a reason. So let's say that it wasn't something people experienced. There's this idea that's put forth that you mentioned in the book of the whole thing just being a play for the land, possibly by the Catholic Church. But then later you point out that they let it sit for how long? 100 years or so before?
Very long time.
Before they made use of it. But
1928.
then, yeah. So that's interesting. But then on the other hand, and it was prophesied that the land that would come into use and in the way that it's being used now, right? By the voice?
Yeah, by the voice.
Okay, so then the question becomes, if the voice is not a paranormal event, but like a folkloric element and this thing that's being told for these long periods of time, what was the point of that, you think? If it's non-paranormal, which is obviously what I would think you would think, what would be the point of that activity?
Why do you think that? I would assume it's non-paranormal.
Because I don't think you believe in it.
That doesn't mean he can't mention it. It should.
The belief is a different thing.
Right.
Okay.
I don't try to pick a side. I think something happened for sure, or else all these stories wouldn't have been told.
Well, like with the 17 years of the voice, somebody could come along at 20 years and say, this has been going on for 17 years. And one person says that, and then you think the thing's been happening for 17 years. How spread out are the details of the voice interactions? Do they cover the 17 years?
They don't cover the 17 years. They basically stop when he moves to Pennsylvania in 1809.
Right.
But Father Gledson says that he would visit Adam up until he died.
Right.
He said that it occurred for 17 years. So it was still happening in Pennsylvania when he moved there.
Like, then that does come back around again to kind of the players in this story. Let's just do a little bit of an overview. We have Adam Livingston and his family, Livingstone or Livingston, which was an anglicized version of Livingstone.
Correct.
His family had immigrated from Germany, right?
Yes.
And with regard to the distaste for the Catholic Church, that was related to experiences that his family had in Germany before coming over.
His father specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The region that they were from had been predominantly Catholic for decades. And then the ruling party took over was Catholic. And when that happens, if the state religion becomes Catholic. And so that's why they decided to move to America.
So that contributes to this overarching idea of him coming over, he's having this problem, and then him not wanting to seek help from the Catholic Church to resolve the problem. And then in the long-term version of the story, eventually he comes over to the Catholic Church and things are made better, except they weren't really, because there was an exorcism, but it didn't exactly work.
There was more than one exorcism too. That's
Yeah.
another story plot that gets played out a lot in the Catholic versions is that, the Episcopalians tried an exorcism and their Bible got put in a chamber pot. And,
Well, not only that, the folklore,
about that one.
I love that too, because it, in the story, of course, you have several different groups coming and nobody can help. First of all, circling back to the Kent Paranormal Weekend, when we did meet the haunted housewives, Kathy and Teresa would tell stories about them doing ghost hunts in their area and their church-going folk. And I believe that the church, people would ask them like, hey, can you check this out? And they said, yeah, did you ask your ministers? Like, no, they won't even come to the house. Methodists, Presbyterians, anybody else besides the Catholics won't even show up, or they won't. If they do, we've heard many stories where they get chased out. We're not talking 1820 here. We're talking 2020. So that's a very common thing. They're just not really equipped. And Reverend Matsky, that you talk about in the book, who's also very connected to Small Town Monsters and a terrific source for information in that regard, will say that, well, we have some books. We said we don't really have any instructional guides on that. Like, there's a book of like weddings and funerals and how to perform rituals for those, but unlike the Catholics who have manuals on these things, which are hundreds of years old, they just don't have the equipment for it. And they don't necessarily believe in that realm, although they do think that there possibly is spiritual oppression. Reverend Matsky would say, like, well, first let's rule out the other natural causes, perhaps mental health issues and other such things, taking a rational approach to it. But in this case, yeah, we have to come and investigate because no one else will look at it, not even their clergy people. And so they don't even mention it because they get made fun of at church. And even Teresa and Kathy have gotten criticized at their own church because they look into this stuff. And of course, their response is, well, what about the Holy Ghost? Isn't that a spirit? Like, well, that's something different. We're not trying to contact them with a 1980s recorder.
I heavily hinted in my third or fourth chapter, I can't remember which, but if there was an exorcism that happened, well, I think there were a few. I don't think it worked.
That is very, very, very common that we hear that somebody's brought in, and to this point that they tried other ministers of other denominations, even being open-minded and just sick and tired of being sick and tired of this thing harassing them. And they brought in some folk medicine practitioners. I thought this was interesting. They bring in herbs, a book, and then riddles to maybe confound the spirit. And those also ended up in the BAM pot, in the chamber pot. So it's like, I don't care who you are. Chamber pot. Yeah, it's like, I don't care who you are, what your deal is, or what you believe in. That's literally going into the crapper. And first of all, it is part of the trickster spirit in that it's a joke, it's a prank, and a statement, and it's irreverent. And that also is very prevalent in all these stories, is this, well, at first, this spirit being very irreverent to, and also maybe mocking the beliefs of the people there, quoting scripture and things like that. And then later, this is what I got from the wizard clip, is that this voice is very demanding in hours of prayer and fasting and belief and doing all these duties. Meanwhile, you're trying to take care of a farm, and that's a lot of work. But it's also, it seemed to me like it was having them do all this stuff that they were willing to do, but it also ultimately was a joke. Like, look what I can get you to do, all this crazy, goofy stuff. And you're just going to do it because I'm telling you, like, this is the way. And so it was almost, it seemed to me like you alluded to in the book, like a cruel joke. But also, whatever it is, it takes a lot more than just one exorcism or one showing of the priest. Like, you got to do it over and over again. And sometimes it never goes away. Sometimes it's like, oh, 2 or 3, and then now things are quiet. Or they're quiet for a while, then it kicks up again. Anyway, that's just a very common thing that you'll hear from ghost manifestation stories and spirit oppression stories, is that it usually doesn't work in one shot.
The Catholics claim that the exorcism was successful and that the spirit was, the next spirit that came was the helpful one. It was a different spirit, but I'm just not so sure, because it did a lot of the same things that we read in these other stories, like the Devil Glim Loose and the Bell Witch. It kept them sleep deprived constantly. It would physically attack them. I'm not sure that I would claim that's helpful. You know, it shattered a mirror and berated the children that were trying on dresses because they weren't modest enough for them.
Right.
I try usually not to let my own thinking come through in the book, but in the stuff that I write. But this was tough because it just, to me, it was evident that this claim that some of the church narratives were making that this thing was helpful was, like you said, it was making fun of them. And that's something that Kate Batts did quite a bit. Right.
Because it also reminded me, and I'm not Catholic, but you hear the stories of the nun that racks your knuckles with a ruler again and again and again. And at some point it's like, okay, I get it. I'm not, you're very strict and I'm trying to learn this stuff. But like at some point people react against it. I've had enough of that. I've had enough of the abuses of past generations. And, there's a line with everything. In this case, at least with the one story that is more the Catholic version, is that, well, they did all this stuff. And again, it was very time consuming. It was annoying. It was a lot to ask, but they did everything. And you would still have the spirit criticizing them constantly. And again, it got physical and angry with them. And so is that the loving instruction that we're told is to be expected? Or is that, again, something that's the feeling I got? And you don't get that in any of the narratives, but I do agree with you in that I don't know if it was a different spirit, but whatever this thing turned into or what replaced it was also something that it's not cruel to be kind, but just, it was making him jump through hoops to see if they would do it. And they did it. And then it was like, okay, I'm kind of bored, I'm gone. And then just, unlike the Bell Witch who said I would return in, was it 100 years?
107, wasn't it?
Yeah, first it was 7 years, and then it was 107 years.
The grandson of John Bell in 1936 or so wrote a book in anticipation of the Bell Witch's return, but it never came back, as far as we know, although there are still residual weirdnesses that go on there.
It was supposed to come back in 1935, and Charles Bailey Bell's book came out in 1933, so he wrote it before it was supposed to happen.
Right.
Well, again, I'll make the connection between the paranormal phenomenon or UFOs or Indrid Cold or anybody else and saying, we'll be back at this time, and then they never come back. There's always that unfulfilled promise of return. And in the Woodstock letters, that passage ends with, it may be interesting to add that the voice made a prophecy that remains to be fulfilled. Now, this is me speaking. A lot of the other prophecies the voice made did come to pass. But this last one here, continuing to read, it was that the property in Virginia left to the church by Mr. Livingston when he was removed to Pennsylvania in 1820 or sooner would be a great place for prayer and fasting before the end of time. It was probably the scene of the miraculous manifestations. That did come to pass, didn't it? About over 100 years later.
Right. Yeah, 1970s. I can't remember the exact year it was open, but Priestfield Pastoral Center is still in existence today.
Yeah.
I visited there a few times.
It sounds like a beautiful place.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I know. Well, after you wrote about it, I was like, oh, I want to go there.
Yeah, and they still talk about weird things happening there. So
yeah.
I talked to a caretaker for quite a bit. She was great.
There was that story about the person who had gone into the woods with his wife or girlfriend or something and tried to take a picture by the stranger's grave and came running out of the woods. And
because it shattered in his hand.
Yeah, the camera shattered in his hand. But, but one thing about the stranger's grave, and that's a prominent part of this story, again, all the different players and stuff, and whether or not the stranger ever actually presented themselves at the crux of the story. And then the grave is out there, and there's a story where they had to consecrate the ground and all of these different things. You also indicated that they did run GPR, ground penetrating radar, over the gravesite and were unable to find anyone actually buried at that particular spot anyway.
That's right. In 2020, when the place shut down because of COVID,
right,
they put it up for sale because they were losing too much money just trying to maintain it. And before they did that, they wanted to do their due diligence and make sure that that they were conveying what they were trying to sell. So they did GPR looking for a graveyard and weren't able to find one.
Okay, so that's interesting.
Mike has a great list of analytical alternatives, I guess you could say, or he has a phrase for it, that you're trying to think about all the logical arguments, and people would say like, well, you know what, this is just a big swindle and ghost story. As Scott and I like to say, it's the Scooby-Doo angle, where we're going to frighten you out of your property. And and if that's the case, though, yes, Livingston donated, or he sold it for $1 to the Catholic Church, essentially around 34 acres. Yeah, they ended up with the property at a reasonable price, but never did anything with it for over 100 years.
Well, there was a legal issue. So there was a trust. It was, I think at the time there was an issue in Virginia with Virginia law about the church being able to own property. So they formed a trust of parishioners that owned the rights to the property. And then eventually they all died off, but one family member, and then they started using the property for themselves. And so the church had to win a
As
lawsuit.
One does. Yeah.
Is that the Mangini family?
That's right. Yeah. So the church won the lawsuit, I think, in 1928 to get the property back. But even then, they didn't do anything with it for another 50 years.
For me, that kind of removes the logic angle on that, that it was a swindle of sorts.
Yeah, but 50, 100 years to the Catholic Church,
well,
it's like sitting at a stoplight.
Hey, well, unless it's right, if you're talking historically, but as we know, dastardly
Did you
deeds
read Pillars of the Earth? I mean, they took 500 just to build one.
Right. But see, that's a different thing, though. You know that you're doing it for posterity. This, as we've seen, there are a lot of, I want you to talk about some of the real life players because they are interesting. Reverend Cahill, for one, and some others that actually came in and were involved. Big characters, big personalities here. Some of them reminding me of the Exorcist case with Ronnie. Just physically strong priests have to come in and restrain people and deal with poltergeist violence. But in this case, with the property here, what we saw is that generally if somebody's doing something untoward or illegal, it's for personal immediate gain, not for generations later. Like it's usually self-interest, like, we can use this now, or this is going to benefit us, because, hey, look, we got to eat, we got to have a place to, even though we've disavowed earthly delights, we're going to take advantage of what we can at the moment. So for me, that it lessens the Scooby angle on that.
For sure. And I don't think the churches have ever made any profit from the property.
Right.
They use it for Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's a abused woman group that meets there, and they use a lot of the dormitories for homeless. So it's a wonderful place for what they do with the little funds they have.
Quick anecdote about that. When you were visiting, and I guess you had your own, this is kind of an emotional, profound moment of peace, I think, with the property. That's aside from anything strange. And when you were meeting with the caretaker, and they were talking about a priest coming in from the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. to do a blessing or cleansing or maybe an exorcism on the place because there was still so much activity there. And it's also something that I've heard quite a bit with mediums and ghost hunters, where perhaps the reason that there is still a lot of spirit activity and paranormal activity is because of the nature of the people that now occupy it and are treated there, and that they're coming with a lot of personal problems and a lot of emotional turmoil, and that maybe causes a rift and a thin place to occur. And as they're healing and getting over their own personal things, people like that often are vulnerable. And as Reverend Maskey says, it's people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, it makes you a little vulnerable. Your veil is a little thinner, and you're perhaps more susceptible to these kinds of forces. So anyway, I just thought that was a very fascinating angle from the priest of like why stuff's still happening. But it may be just the ground itself. There's something about this place. I don't know. It either spawned the story created it, or that, or it has nothing to do with it. But it's just a very nice place that people over the generations have focused on.
Hello, everyone. I'm Derek Smith, and this is Astonishing Legends. Let's get back to the show.
Another common story element in all of these is there's something about haunted fireplaces. There's something about the hearth and fire and stones. Big stones had dropped down, I guess, from the chimney and rolled around on the floor spinning that the Livingstons and their some of the, I think, parishioners that came by had to wrestle with. And so things coming from the fireplace, or balls of fire coming out from the hearth and the fireplace rolling around the floor, but also spontaneous combustion, the beds, that would be the most annoying. And beds and clothing catching fire. Where else do we hear that? Sally House, take a drink. We just have to say that for legal reasons. So fire is a big part of it. And then I'll just leave you with this quick anecdote. I recently was talking to a terrific producer who worked on a lot of ghost shows decades ago and had been all over the world, Europe, some of the most haunted locations. And I asked them, there's the common question, what have you seen? And I was like, well, there was a lot of things I think that were overreacted to that I didn't really notice, but there was one time, and then this is the caveat of everybody who doesn't believe, there was that one time where this thing happened. And she said that they were scouting a location with the caretaker of this ancient castle, I think. It was a bare room that had been cleared out and you could visit it. But as they were standing there, broad daylight, a stone from the fireplace hearth came out vertically, horizontally from the mantle and just did a 90-degree drop right in front of them. And they all just stood there, and she was like, oh my goodness, that's undeniable. That just happened. And the host says, yeah, that happens all the time. So it's a different perspective, but there's something about, and maybe it's because it's the centerpiece of the family and activity and cooking and life and nourishment, but also cleansing and to get your attention, and it's primitive TV. There's something about the fireplace and fire being a focal point of it.
I think it was interesting that it started off really kind of annoying.
Yeah.
It'd irritate people to get them to yell at them, and it would, it'd make them run around trying to put out fires or sleep in the cold or stay awake. And then it started destroying things. It got angry.
Yeah, it's akin to torture. I mean, sleep deprivation and noises, and
poked with needles,
which comes back to that whole trickster idea. But it can't, I find myself wondering as the story is going on, it's like, well, did the story become more and more torturous because the Catholic Church wanted to convey you know, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't come over and hang out with us and do our things. When I'm trying to figure out from this, all of this, with like, did something really happen? And if so, what, without all the embellishment? And the question is, what's in there? Because, you know, there's things about this story that, which you look at all of it and you think, oh, well, this could be misunderstandings or something that got blown out of proportion, or maybe the neighbors didn't like them and they would stand outside the house at night and yell things and scare them at 3 a.m. and they just leaned into the fact that it was a disembodied voice and didn't go outside and try to find the person or whatever, you know, those things. Of course, there's a difference between that and having your clothes being clipped apart while you're wearing them and not knowing it, if those accounts are all true. But I wonder about the parts of the details. What is the underlying root here? And I want to circle back to that, but that's just I want to put that out there, ruminate on it for a second.
The one piece of evidence that really got me was this 18th century version of a Twitter battle between Mary Livingston and that priest Phelan in the newspapers.
Yeah.
Where she definitely was, I don't think she ever converted to Catholicism. She felt that there was something going on there. But she also admitted that things were happening in the house that she couldn't explain. Right. I don't know why she would admit that if it wasn't happening, because it helped the Catholic claim.
By the way, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of those points that makes you think there's something real or inexplicable at the root of this, or something that people don't understand. Of course, this is before, if you're looking at the rational, mundane explanations, this is before people understood what the presence of CO2 or, you know, other things like that might cause you to have issues. They weren't looking at that kind of thing, or other environmental issues that maybe would cause strange things to happen, or you to perceive strange things happening. But they're at that point where they're like, this did happen. It just gets so sophisticated. It starts out kind of simple, and, you know, someone's putting a rope across the road. That could be a kid, whatever. But then it gets more and more complex with the omniscience of the voice and all of that. It's like, again, reminds me of the Bell Witch. One of the things that you had mentioned when you recounted near the end of the book in similar stories, The Devil of Glen Luce, which all the similarities in that. There's one point here which I thought was interesting. This is on page 116. The haunting began as a random shrill whistling in and outside the house. According to witnesses, the sound was similar to the resonance made by toy glass whistles. One afternoon, one of the daughters, Janet Campbell, became annoyed by the whistling as she left home to get a bucket of water and complained under her breath, "I would fain hear thee speak as well as whistle." And then the response she heard was, "I'll cast thee, Janet, into the well," a threatening voice unexpectedly replied. This sudden manifestation was extra disturbing because it was a perfect mimic of Janet's voice. And what struck me about that particular detail in the Glen Luce case is we have heard this exact thing on EVPs. We have actually heard this. I think it's a James Willis recording, actually. Yeah, with his team member, you can hear her voice on the recording, but she was out in the van. Like, it was inside the house, and it sounded like her laughing.
We have also no shortage of listeners sending us emails where they've also heard a vocal doppelganger of themselves or a family member.
Sounds like them. Or someone who's part of their team that is not there at that moment. And the other thing that happens is questions get answered before you finish asking them. Not to derail us into EVPs.
No, but I would say, like, these stories, the local legends and lore, just, again, it's the chicken and egg. Like I said, if this is a made-up story, it's got some pretty good story elements. It's got some good narrative, tidbits here that are pretty universal, that people report in real life, or, are people reporting that because of these 1,000 years of stories or more that all have the same elements going back to classical times.
Yeah, the voice in the wizard clip, I think, it mimicked a deceased cousin of Adam at one point. And I know Kate Batts, which did a lot of that, right, Heather?
Yeah, she did. She was really good about that. She could mimic any voice, even an ocean away.
That's right. She had a whole, like, Rich Little thing going. I forgot about
it was the Englishman. I can't remember what his profession was, but he came, that's a long ways to go just to check out a ghost story. And then he reported hearing his mother's voice. He gets back to England and she reports that she heard his voice. And what is he doing there? And she heard some other information. So it's by location, it's instantaneous. And they heard report of that because he sent a letter back saying like, yeah, that happened. That was odd. I don't know. There again, you wonder if all this is sparked, birthed from some real phenomenon, and you're getting parts of it. And then, you get concretion of other story and legend lore elements that go around it, but the heart of it is really, truly something weird. But also you have some very strange players. One, Father Phelan, who had some involvement, I think, in kind of the spiritual cleansing and exorcisms there, was, I don't know, he kind of perhaps a sketchy character. He ends up being charged for murder of a fellow priest later on.
Yeah, he's the one that claimed it was a hoax.
Yeah.
Early on, and then later was charged with murder, but acquitted.
Okay, acquitted, but just a character, as they would say, and he said got into it with one of the descendants,
with Mary Livingston, with the wife.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the original
in the newspapers.
And so yes, Mary is the wife of Adam, long-suffering wife. And then we have the other very notable character, founded the town of Loretto in Pennsylvania. Speak about him a bit, because he's got quite a storied history.
Yeah, Father Golitsyn there's books written about him, and for good reason. Very interesting person. He was a Russian prince born in The Hague. His father was a diplomat, also a prince. So he was raised very much among the Western European elite. His father was friends with Voltaire and Diderot.
That's right.
And his mother was a Prussian countess. He had a gilded life ahead of him, but he gave it all up as a teenager when he came to the U.S. for a tour. So wealthy children, especially men, before they joined a military tour, which is Russian custom at the time, they would go tour the world, and the world meant Europe. But at that time, the Reign of Terror was happening, so it was not good for any nobles to be trying to visit, France or wherever he was going to go to. So he went to the United States with a priest as his attendant, and he was introduced to the first Catholic bishop, Bishop Carroll in Baltimore. He was originally supposed to go be an aide to George Washington, but his mom became convinced that was a bad idea because George was a deist, and it would ruin his Catholic upbringing. When he got to the United States, he became enamored by this Bishop Carroll and decided to give up all his titles and become a priest in the United States as a missionary. So he went from incredibly wealthy overnight to a poor priest living in the western frontier in Loretto, Pennsylvania.
It is amazing.
But rich with intellectual pursuits. He probably became disillusioned. Everybody's getting disillusioned in this story as well, including Adam Livingston's father, with the state of German politics. And just people being, I think this is another aspect of the story, people becoming disillusioned with the current state of either politics or religion that they're ascribed to and switching it up. And Father Golitsyn is doing the same.
The European wars the wars of religion have been going on for a couple hundred years or longer by that time. And so I'm sure everybody that was in the States had been affected by it at one point or another. Not to sum up such an interesting life with a couple words, but he has been, I don't know if nominated is the right term, but the church is vetting him for sainthood.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I can say Father Golitsyn probably was one of the most successful missionaries in that part of the world because he spoke so many languages.
Right.
And could relate to so many people.
Right. And you conveyed that very well in the book, just because they needed somebody who could do outreach, and he was able to do it and for all these, so many other ones, they probably had the language barrier, which made it a lot more difficult. He's truly a fascinating guy. And so where the monument to him, is that you have a picture of? Is that in the town?
That's in Loretto at the Basilica.
That's in Loretto. Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The town he founded, or the village. Yeah.
Do you have any idea why they're pursuing the possibility of canonization for him?
I would have to look into that more, but I'm sure it has to do with the town and the mission that he set up in Western Pennsylvania. Was the first one across the alley. It's on the Chestnut Ridge. If that
Okay.
interests anybody.
Ooh, yeah. Okay. Now we're back to the spooky terrain, the land being part of it.
Yeah, when I went to visit it, I did not know it was there until I drove there, and I was like, oh I didn't realize.
There's been a few revelations with this story for yourselves and the reader, I think. Heather, just quick question. Are there any other heroic clergy persons that feature in any other folklore that you know of?
Not that are on the top of my head right now. Not named ones. I can think of stories where this goes back to like werewolf lore, where people would save someone that was in like mid transition, and then we're given extra blessings for that from the church. But there's nothing that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Like the accounts of Father Gallitzin and these priests and the family members who have been writing about it continually. Not so much Adam, weirdly again, the patriarch, but you have a monument to somebody who was really involved, and it does, to me, point to something, again, really happening with this. Somebody saw something that was out of the ordinary, in magical, fantastical, more so times than perhaps today, because there's so much noise going on. And one of the thoughts I had in conclusion or an epilogue to the story here in the book was that, why doesn't events like this happen these days? Why isn't there some house that's got all this craziness? And like, it kind of does, but in a different scenario, like LaToya Amon's house, the demon house, as the Zach Bagans documentary has profiled, with an infestation at least and oppression going on, but it's not received the same way. It's minor lore, because we have so much other noise going on now, whereas here things are a lot more clear. It's easy to focus on these things. I think that's why they prevail. And you make another point, both you and Heather, that why isn't this as popular as the Bell Witch story? Yes, we had the Blair Witch Project that popularized the Bell Witch. Loftus Hall is more popular, of course, in Ireland as a local story. Glen Luce, maybe only in some parts of it being known in Scotland at the time, but this thing never really caught on, and it's as fantastical as these other stories. Why is that?
Caught on within the Catholic community, but it definitely did not amongst the rest of the population. And I think it might have had something to do with the prejudice against the Catholic community that was very prevalent at that time. But also, I will be the first to admit that some of the narratives that were written by the church are hard to read. They're just not
right.
It
doesn't flow right.
Yeah, it's not like the novel that M.V. Ingram wrote. That's very well done. This is
right. Ingram's going to get optioned. The other scripts are going in the trash.
No, it's like you said, Father Fanati, who chronicled a lot of this and wrote and received letters. Yeah, he just didn't have the knack for a good narrative. It's kind of all over the place. It's hard to piece together. Again, this is all very fragmented. And so no one really kind of came by and put the whole story together, other than these short anecdotes that showed up in these various locations again, and no major book that caught on, or of course at the movie didn't turn into a major motion picture. I mean, Heather, why do other folklore stories at the time seem to persist and survive, even if they're not that great? Like, even if they kind of fizzle out or they're just kind of undramatic?
Well, I think that some of it, like Mike said, has to do with the prejudice, perhaps. But then also, in general, if you look at just the terminology that we're using and what sticks, in folklore, you're going to hear a lot more about witches. We as humans have gravitated toward that term for good and bad, a lot more than we've gravitated toward wizards.
Interesting.
I think that just one by the nomen that's used in general could be part of the reason that it didn't stick, because it has all of the elements, the same elements that the Bell Witch story has, and more. And you certainly can't blame religion in general as a blanket term, religion as the reason why. So it has to be something to do with prejudice, and also maybe just not written as smoothly, like you said. And Hollywood hasn't picked it up.
Right.
The poor storytelling, I'm convinced that had something to do with it, because Fanati's monograph is, I don't think it would have been published if it wasn't for that it was published by a relative of the McSherrys.
Right. Right.
Right. The publishing company owned it. It was owned by Mr. Pyatt, who was married to a McSherry.
Okay. Yes. Nepo babies from the 19th century. Also bad 19th century SEO. Just didn't track. And that's interesting though, is that, for lack of a better term, it's just not as sexy
it's poorly written.
It didn't play well. Again, another fascinating element of why some stories persist and become better movies than others. And of course, there's some, I don't think there's any, has there been any movies or any other media that portray the Wizard Clip story as there has been with the Bell story?
No, not that I'm aware of.
It's going to happen soon. You probably have started that fire.
I was going to say not yet.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you that.
I did, when I inscribed my copy that I sent to Seth, I said, this is the Bell Witch prequel.
Yes. By the way, one of the other things about this book is just, it's one of the most amazing forewords I've ever read.
And why, Scott? Why is that?
Because I wrote it.
Okay.
No, I know. Dude, I was honored to be asked to do that. So thank you very, very much for that. I was really honored.
I'm so glad you did it.
Yeah. My son thinks I'm an actual person now. So he's like, oh, your name's on the cover.
No, I mean, being online or, streaming does not count. It just,
this doesn't count.
A book is more permanent, but that goes to.
Yeah. After the EMP, this will be around. Our podcast will be gone.
There is some permanence with the writing in
the
that
solar flare.
It's down there for everyone to see. So unless that's been changed, it's different than verbal accounts handed down, which again, it's that big, long generational telephone game where elements change, but then at least certain aspects of it have to kind of stay the same. Is that you have to, there are some loose rules. Would you agree, Heather, to a good folkloric tale told around the fire and passed down from generations, that it does kind of self-govern by its own narrative rules and has to stay within its own guardrails?
There's definitely certain elements that every folktale needs to have to keep it snazzy, so to speak, interesting, and something that you'd want to hear around a campfire tale, and something also that's easy to remember.
Yes.
You can't get into super detailed things unless you're talking about Homer, where you're going in verse and that's how you remember each particular line.
Right.
There's certain elements that have to be really fantastic and stick there for it to continue to go through the generations.
You sent a lot of really great picturs. Thank you so much. We'll have those on the website. Lots of great links. But one thing I did want to ask was about the signs that are around Middleway. All those signs, what is the number on the sign? Is it just like a museum tour stop number?
Walking tour.
Okay,
yeah, it's a walking tour.
Mm-hmm. I thought maybe it was some advanced symbology that I didn't understand that was somehow related to the story. It's like, why is this 44? Did 44 incidents happen here? Okay, so now I got that. I want to go up there so bad. So those are really cool. Those signs are so cool. So it looks like a beautiful town.
And Jessie will show you around. She'll take you everywhere you want to see.
I would love to do that. And it's funny. I've been, as you know, and a lot of our listeners know, my wife and I used to live in New York, and we had a place in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, but we're from North Carolina. And every time we came down to North Carolina, we wanted to go around DC because of the traffic. We took 81 and came down through the Shenandoah Valley every time. It's one of the most beautiful drives in the country. And we just went right by this place over and over and over again. And I didn't know it, which is a bummer because we could have just shot over there. So I do know where that is. It's not far from here, really. It's not as far as we went for the Pig Lady Festival. So
that's right. How many hours did you drive for that? And when the internet didn't even work?
I think it was 9, I think.
Felt so bad.
No, dude, it was so much fun. It was such a great memory for me and my son. He had a great time.
You had that cool camper thing?
Yeah. I still got that tent going. So yeah, that's fun. I'm curious in the thing that you worked so hard to keep out of this book, which is your personal beliefs. If I ask you these questions, are you going to answer them? Or should I just not even bother? Should I tell Sarah this never happened?
Oh, well, we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Okay. All right.
We'll see if I ask you to do another forward.
Ask Forrest. He's good. He's good at.
Well, Forrest, I don't know if he told you what I inscribed in the book. I basically asked him to write the forward so I could get a promotion in the Ark. I wanted to
That's
be
right,
the
the
director.
director
Okay,
of
well,
poltergeist.
You can run the whole thing.
In terms of what you do, being a disciplined and intelligence analyst in your day job, and you talk about a lot of ideas in here, which I thought were super fascinating, and some of which we've been exposed to before, and some we haven't. But the migration of folklore that moves along with immigrants from other places, that's obviously something that's sort of the kind of thing that we've come across before. And also what I thought was interesting was the possibility, and we've touched on this, of maybe different religions counter-programming through a narrative that's already happening and trying to say, okay, see what happens if you play with fire, come over here for protection. But I don't think you were necessarily seeking out any sort of paranormal or unexplained mystical solutions to some of the things that were reported in this story. Are there parts of this mystery that you felt like, in terms of events that took place and the evidence that you saw, that you can't personally rationally explain or get to the bottom of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it can be explained away with, migration to folklore and additional storytelling aspects of them and added to it for decades afterwards. But that letter series in the newspaper, that's still, you can still find it, between Adam Livingston's wife and Father Phelan, where she talks about it and she calls it the spent. She doesn't even want to refer to it as the voice like everybody else. She's mad about it.
Right.
There's emotion in that letter that got me. That's what convinced me something happened. I just don't know what exactly happened.
That's the exact same kind of thing that I latch onto when we're covering something. You get down to an account, a witness account, that you can tell you're dealing with a person who has experienced something very real to them, at least. And then the next level you go to is like, all right, well, was that person being tricked? Or because that person is not, it seems like that person is not perpetrating a hoax. So now the next level is like, they're either being hoaxed or something truly unexplainable happened to them. And it's hard to make those assertions assumptions either way, because you don't know about that person that's presenting it. But I love that. That's a really cool answer to that.
It can be complete coincidence, but I was very much struggling with trying to figure out how to come up with an alternative to the folklore migration theory until the Astonishing Junk Drawer #1. And I wrote about it, exactly how it happened. I put it on. I was tired. I was going to go to bed. And then I was like, whoa, there's the answer to my problem.
I thought that was very fascinating. I was not expecting that towards the end of the book there. And in fact, we'll play it right here.
Now, this comes from someone I'm going to keep anonymous here because they request it. And as you'll see why when I get done reading it. And the title is Angels and Demons. And the message is, Dear Forrest, Scott, and the Astonishing Legends team. I am a new listener and somewhat hooked. I don't want to fire off a really long email right now, as my experience over the last couple of years has been so random and perhaps seemingly unconnected to third parties. I believe that I suffer from bipolar disorder. Extended periods of euphoric creativity, pocked with trough days of crippling hopelessness and apathy. I haven't contacted anyone for diagnosis, as I have a history of mental illness, and I don't want to add a bipolar label to my resume. It's been hard enough trying to integrate the more recent bizarre and mystical experiences, my surprising conversion to Christianity after being an obnoxious and outspoken atheist for 32 years, and navigating the world in the current pandemicized landscape. Also on good days, my ideas and energy for the creation of paintings and music seems to bubble up in my brain, fully formed from nowhere. I seem to receive conceptual downloads and have the ability to weave disparate ideas together as intricate tapestries, in parentheses, though perhaps this is just DID and delusions of grandeur. Although I can be like a bear with a sore head sometimes, I know that the better part of my psychology is responsible for true creativity, and I am reluctant to risk that by introducing brain-altering chemistry into the mix. That said, I'm feeling low right now. I don't have a therapist and feeling a little crushed by the torrent of domestic crises that have arisen seemingly since my baptism in October last year. I wanted to reach out, partly for selfish cathartic reasons. I've been listening to the series on The Exorcist and Devil's Den and The Vertical Plane, all outstandingly interesting.
The thing I am stuck on is yes, everything is connected. So, my story in short, I had an epiphany the day my 5-year-old daughter was born. Then, bored at work, I began indulging myself in YouTube documentaries on alien abduction. Meanwhile, I began practicing yoga and transcendental meditation and naturally began opening up to the ideas of aliens and all other fringe topics, remote viewing, telepathy, chaos magic, etc., etc. In the spring of 2020 and the first UK lockdown, I made use of the ability to stay up late and began meditating on my garden deck between 12 and 1 a.m. every night. I would recite my own CE5 protocol / mantra / invocation / invitation, sit in silence, and watch. I began reliably seeing high-altitude craft and once one much lower basketball-sized UFO above our house. Just glowing orbs of light, and the lower one an unearthly silent golden one. It brightly shimmered and glistened, but it didn't project light. I had to end my experiments reasonably abruptly after a week or two because a nastier side to the phenomenon began to occur, what Scott refers to as the trickster element. Cupboard doors would pop open, cups would fall off kitchen counters, keys would go missing and reappear in weird places. There was also a uniquely terrifying series of sleep paralysis encounters. Then, that all stopped when I heard a voice that woke me up from sleep and continued upon waking, quoting scripture to me. I have never been a church-going Christian. Both my now wife and then I began having scriptural quotes spoken to us in dreams by disembodied voices and angelic figures, for which we actually had to buy a Bible to reference. After that, prayers, in parentheses, to the God of the Bible, closed parentheses, began being answered directly, and the rest is recent history. Now, forgive me, I am not trying to evangelize you, but after having attempted in earnest to contact ETs, to then encounter something which first presented itself as glowing and benign, but then transmute into something demonic and aggressive, only then to be saved, quote unquote, by an actual calming presence of something I can only describe as loving, and to have authority above the darkness, has led this once skeptical atheist to two conclusions. One, I have been called by name, spoken to, and guided by the Holy Spirit to find Jesus. Or, I am in communication with a spiritual / invisible / off-world intelligence that can not only hear my thoughts / prayers, parentheses, which are obviously non-local to my brain / skull, that for some reason wants me to believe in the Trinitarian God of the Christian faith. What do you think? I would love to discuss this properly and fill in the gaps. I'm not looking for airtime, just some people who approach this stuff with a scientific mindset without all the sniggering and immediate disbelief. Please keep up the amazing work. You're doing so much for the world's entertainment and spiritual development. Kind regards.
What about that email helped you figure out where you wanted to go with the end of the book?
When I do, even when I'm doing analysis, I don't play in black and white. It's a likelihood spectrum. And so the alternative analysis section of that book was really an alternative to what everybody will say. It's folklore migration from Scotland all the way to Mississippi, and as an intelligence analyst, I never deal in fact. We have to have this likelihood spectrum, and I wanted to provide something that folks can at least chew on a little bit. But I was struggling. I just, to me, it's my own biases, I guess. I can't believe that this, an entity will show up every 100 years or so for the last 300-400 years to harass a family for no reason, and then for years on end, and then leave.
Right.
Without
okay,
reason.
thanks. Tip my hat.
Yeah.
Bye. See you next century. Yeah.
So when I heard that emailer, and I think they were from England, if I remember right, talk about how they were bored during COVID.
Yeah.
So they started practicing basically conjuring. They were doing incantations and mantras and stuff trying to invite things in. And then they started seeing lights. And then poltergeist activity started happening. And he was saved by a disembodied voice that read scripture to him.
Yeah.
I was like, that is all these stories we're just talking about in the book rolled up into one.
Yeah.
That's happening today.
Right.
Or relatively close to today.
Similar balls of fire, not really. Yeah. We're not talking triangular craft, but similar to the UAP phenomenon. As we bookend this with discussion from the beginning that there is often a connection to religious ecstasy in a way, and experiences and visions and characters from biblical literature that show up or connected or transmorph into something else. And then you wonder, what's the connection? Well, there's a whole branch or party of UAP researchers who believe that there is a spiritual connection to aliens, frankly, that is possibly demonic, that is possibly, obviously, a trickster element, even from from members of the military community who have investigated on Skinwalker Ranch, that there is definitely a trickster element. They don't know what it is. It scares the crap out of hardened veterans, multi-tour veterans in war zones, that whatever this is, it's real and they don't want to deal with it. And so there is an aspect of physicality, reality, spirituality to this. And as that story, to me, I had to re-listen to it. Scott found it again. That was the first juncture I kind of forgot what we were talking about when I read it in your book. Like, wait, what? Really? It had that much of a profound impact? And thank you for listening, by the way, Mike. But the other aspect of it is,
I'm still a fan.
Well, I know that's the most, that is the most mysterious thing about all of this. I cannot figure that out. But in reading and listening to that story again, it does follow this very common pattern that we were talking about towards the beginning. Again, Orfeo Angelucci, this cosmic mystical interconnection with, for some experiences, not all, and it's actually, I would say, probably a smaller fraction, but there is an occult, spiritual aspect of all of this phenomenon in general. And so, one cannot be divorced from the other, I think. And here you don't have, in the Wizard Clip story, you have a disembodied, omniscient voice that has a lot of physical power and poltergeist strength to it. And there are balls of fire, but nothing comes out of a silver craft or airship, perhaps, of the time, as they might have described it. And so that element is there, but all these other elements are, and that has never changed, I think, throughout the history of folklore, is that there is, you have on the other side ghosts and gods and fae and fauna, and you have these mystical creatures like Pan that have powers, and they're messing with us, and they're playing horrible practical jokes on us, but they also behave very badly or very questionably to our standards. And it's all kind of this big stew of the unknown. And then it's like, well, what do we have left over that's actually real out of this? Well, I think at the very least, if you believe these people or you know them, then they relay an experience that, according to the Wizard Clip story, so many people came by, just like the Bell story, and experienced it for themselves. And boy, wouldn't that be something if you could just do that nowadays.
It beats the mystery spot.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that you could have this like, okay, that was weird, or this part of the room gets smaller, or it seems to. Here, it's like anybody that showed up to try and challenge this thing had an experience of their own that was to their chagrin. A woman who shows up with her kind of like, well, I have to see. Again, this is the Gladys Kravitz. Speaking of Bewitched, and again, Bewizarded, not as sexy a title as Bewitched or have the same attractive elements to it. You have the Gladys Kravitz thing of the nosy neighbor. Like, I got to find out what's happening over here. They go over there. She has, this woman puts her brand new silk hat into a handkerchief in her pocket so it doesn't get clipped. She walks out of there just spending a few minutes and opens up the kerchief or napkin, and it's been cut to ribbons, this brand new silk thing. It's like, no, you can't get away from me. I just cost you $20 or however expensive that thing was. And so that is different, where it's like something
that's identical to the big shot that showed up at the Bell House, right? He was like, I'll show you. He went in there and it just like yeah. Who was that guy? I can't remember.
He claimed to be a witch tamer. And he came in and said he had a silver bullet and he was gonna take care of it. And she said, okay, go ahead and try. And he ended up running out of there with pins and needles feeling. And
he was with Andrew Jackson's
yes, he was.
his cadre.
There was one of those in the Hardesty narrative. Of the Wizard clip where he came, a blustery gentleman with a rifle came to take care of the witch and the wizard, and it clipped his pants. So
I love that too. I made a mention of that to Scott. That's also part of the trickster element where, and again, that's part of the legends and lore. You know, we love to pass these stories down. Young folks like to tempt fate. It's like, I'll show you, or it's a good place for people of the opposite sex to meet and congregate. And I think in this case they had a dance.
Produce section at the grocery store.
Nah, I don't know. People don't even. Well, it used to be the mall. Now it's just your. I guess it's your phone or whatever app is current, and you're swiping right or left or whatever. But in this case, everybody shows up to the house for a dance or a get together. The young folks, and of course, there's always that one guy, the blustery guy. It's like, he shows up also with his rifle. Like, I'll show you. And has the seat of his. I had to kind of, with the wording, kind of piece together what was happening. But basically, the seat of his pants gets clipped out, or his, as I said, his nether garments. And what I realized, like, he's dancing and he feels this flapping on his legs, and he realizes that his cheeks are hanging out. So then he has to sit down for the rest of the dance. And then at an opportune moment, probably between songs, he has to back out of the house. And it's like, okay, he wasn't cut or slashed, or it's like, how dare you, I'll battle you. And it was a prank. It was a humiliation done to the overly bold.
It would do that. It would play pranks, and then it would decapitate animals.
Yeah.
That's right. The ducks. The ducks.
Yeah. You're talking about that possibly being known by some members of the McSherry family. Right. And them carrying that from, that happening in Scotland, and only being about maybe 75 miles as the crow flies to Ireland, where they're from. And it's like, maybe they heard that, and somehow that comes over, and the women of the McSherry family are more apt to remember this and retell the story. The men may have told the story, but then they professionally don't want to distance themselves. So maybe there's some aspect there. But the 75 miles, it rang true with something that we were reminded of again with the vertical plane story, and that happening in northern Wales, I think, if I remember correctly, and that one aspect happened 30 miles away from another strange incident that happened with the school and where the computer was found. And we were once again reminded by our lovely UK listeners of the old saying, in the UK, 100 years is a very short amount of time, and 100 miles is a very long ways. And it's the reverse in the US. 100 miles is nothing. That could be a commute. And 100 years, that's a long time. So it's a lot of it's perspective. And in this very young or much younger country, we had to get it together very quickly. And in a short amount of time, things have transmuted so quickly that, like with this story, our testimonies and articles have gotten lost. And that's why my hat's off to you, both of you, for digging through and finding these things that are so important, I think, and get lost so easily here, where maybe they're not so much in Europe. We get so many great stories from people who are invested, and I'm talking about story research. One of them being Butch Cassidy, and one of our close art member friends here, and he's compiled so much, and we're going to do something with it at some point. The elements did seem to kind of fall together here about presenting the story, and Scott visiting, and he's very excited about that. And I was excited that he got to be part of. It's a bit of tradition, and it's regional. It's like these festivals that you work really hard to put together, just so the people around there can have some enjoyment.
Yeah,
and
it's a lot of work.
I think Heather would agree. That's how we keep stories going and alive, and that we're losing a lot of that. And now, not that the old trope of creepypasta's taken over, but like, it's not the same. I don't think it's cherished in the same way. And then you have these things that are phenomena and go viral in our digital online world, but it's just a lot of noise, I think. And it's hard to sift through. And then sometimes something tragic and horrible happens because somebody takes it too far. And that's not how folklore should unfold and be remembered. We're just full of memes and tropes now. And I think we're getting away from something that was really part of the founding of any society, but also America, United States. and the traditions that were brought over, which have a lot to do with how these things come and are shaded and the lenses that we look through them. And that, yeah, they didn't evolve in a vacuum here, which I think is a great point that you brought up in the book, is that this story may be just a collection of strange events, but the way that we tell them and the way that we understand them and the way that we pass them down is rooted in ancient tradition. And we carry that on today. It's just now that there's a different tool, and it's not the campfire so much. It's not the book. It's the device in your pocket giving you snippets of a lot of garbage, in my opinion. So thank you for what you two do, writing books, telling stories, doing research, presenting it.
Holding festivals.
Yes.
Exactly.
That's what I'm talking about. It's all about community and having something valuable and worthwhile. And I think that is rare, fleeting, and hopefully doesn't die out with the efforts that you two put forward.
It is amazing.
Well, as the final word here, I want to end by reading a bit from the epilogue from Mike's book. And I thought it was a really lovely thought and very well expressed. And in this epilogue that he is titled Hauntings, Exorcism, and Mental Illness, because, again, being an analyst, he's got to look at every factor as to its likelihood. And that has to be addressed. Is this all some kind of mental health episode from the very late 18th century, going in generations into the 19th century? And it's a valid question, I think. But you look at the likelihood of that being the case. And so the best thing also, I think, when you're a serious researcher is you turn to an expert. And that's what Mike has done. Mike starts off the epilogue saying, Pastor Matsky's assertion that clergy should address the potential for mental illness as causation in cases like the Wizard Clip prompted a conversation with Melissa Davies. Melissa is a longtime practicing clinical psychologist. We became acquaintances through our mutual affection for legends, and I have been a past guest on her podcast, Ohio Folklore. She was kind enough to answer several questions. Well, from what I remember, this is me speaking now, Mike, is that you're asking her the question, could this have been a mental illness condition with Adam Livingston? And folks can read it for themselves, but basically I think the argument is that hallucinations, if this was one, are pervasive, not location specific. So the fact that this didn't carry on to other locations, other people seeing this and the same hallucination in other places doesn't really point to a mental illness causation, at least. And also a large number of people seeing the same thing.
And they're debilitating. You can't function without therapy.
Right, exactly. He wouldn't have been able to farm, neither would the other members of the family. I mean, they had it rough enough with no sleep for weeks on end, but this doesn't cure itself, as Dr. Davies says. It doesn't go away on its own. It's only tempered nowadays, at least with medication. So, yeah, all of that really speaks to me as not being the case that people were, it's not radon, I don't think, coming out of the ground. It's not carbon monoxide. There was something else, if happening and unseen, it was something else rather than perhaps a more medical explanation. But what I wanted to read is your last question to her that you end the book on. How does your mental health expertise influence your interest in folklore as a podcaster and author, particularly concerning research? Dr. Davies responds, I appreciate this question and how it pulls my passions into one response. Over my 17 years of independent practice as a clinical psychologist, I've heard countless stories from patients about their unexplained experiences. To be clear, the vast majority of my patients suffer mild to moderate depression and anxiety, not the severe illness I described earlier. These very sane people report discovering things like a recently deceased loved one's photograph, somehow removed from the wall and placed in the center of a room, disembodied sounds, and crackling phone messages left by phone numbers that once belonged to their deceased loved ones. In short, I've come to realize that there are some things about the way this universe works that we don't fully know or understand, and perhaps we're not meant to. Folklore is born in what remains in the gap between what we can explain and what we experience. Mystic experiences capture our imaginations because, as humans, we are meaning makers. We draw upon our cultural backgrounds to tell a story to make it make sense. For many of us, that means turning to things like religious texts and oral histories, and this certainly seems to be the case with the Wizard Clip.
That's going to wrap up our episode on the Appalachian Legend of the Wizard Clip, America's first poltergeist. A very special thanks to author Michael Kishbucher and classicist, Appalachian folklore expert, and lead researcher and producer for Small Town Monsters, Heather Moser, for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new show. In the meantime, look for a new Astonishing Junk Drawer from us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends. Don't forget to find and subscribe to the other 2 shows on the Astonishing Legends Network, The Midnight Library and Scared All the Time. Both are available wherever you get your podcasts.
Astonishing Legends is edited by Sarah Voorhees-Wendell at VW Sound and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also head of research and the social media manager. Our technical producer is Ed Vicola, or as we call him, the Mechanic. Special thanks to our announcer, John Boland.
Hi, I'm Zach Bennett.
Hi, I'm Scarlett.
I'm Derek Smith. ZAC
Galaxy Wide in Perpetuity.
BENNETT. I'm ready for more Astonishing Legends.
T is in Tom, T is in Tom.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane at foundermusic.com. All other music and sound design for the show is composed and created by Alan Carestia.
Our logo was created by Tommy Beaver Design, and our animated graphics for social media and YouTube are done by Joshua Sloan at deadstreetproductions.com.
Every episode going back to September of 2020 has a transcription available on its corresponding webpage at our website. Earlier transcriptions can be made available upon request to astonishingcontact@gmail.com.
Astonishing Legends would not be possible without you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Instagram, Twitter, Discord, Facebook, and YouTube.
You can also visit us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content, including the Patreon exclusive show, Astonishing Junk Drawer, which is available every week. The main show is not. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.